Thank you, Dominique, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all of you for being here today. And thank you, Dominique, again for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and talking about my research, especially because this is a very wide audience and very diverse audience, so I'm really excited about your perspectives because I know a lot of you are from different fields. Today I will be talking about my research on stigma research in the media, and particularly I'll be focusing on unintended consequences. So let's start with defining stigma, because even within the field of social psychology, there are a ton of different definitions of stigma. So if you look at a more traditional definition, the first one that Goffman made, he says stigma is a sign or a mark that designates the bearer as spoiled and therefore as valued less than normal people. So he focused on this mark and being valued less than. And then, as I said, there are a ton of definitions, and the one I tend to focus on in my work is a more recent definition by Dovidio and colleagues. And they defined it as the recognition of differences based on a distinguishing characteristic or mark and a consequent devaluation of the person. So similar idea. And when we look at stigma, the motivation for my research is that stigma is negatively impacting people's well-being and health. We know that individuals who are stigmatized tend to have more negative consequences in terms of their health, their well-being, and job opportunities, and all of that. So this is highly motivating my research. I am also interested in stigma because it is widespread. Anyone could be stigmatized based on the context. So, for example, women in STEM fields tend to be stigmatized. Men could be stigmatized in more verbal domains. So anyone practically could be stigmatized. White men tend to be stigmatized in athletic areas. So it applies to everyone depending on what context you're looking at. And as you got that from the previous point, it is very context and culture dependent. For example, as I said, the culture of STEM tends to stigmatize women, and that is a culture that women tend to be stigmatized a lot. So it is very dependent on how the context, what the context cues us. And it is also cross-culturally prevalent. And the different types of stigma changes a lot by culture, but stigma is observed in many different cultures. I have a lot of cross-cultural work, but I won't be focusing on that part a lot today, but my work is very much influenced by cross-cultural research. So just before I go into the specifics of today's talk, this is kind of like the broader area of what I work on. And in terms of experiences of stigmatized individuals, I use methods such as cross-cultural surveys, big Twitter data, and longitudinal experiments. And in terms of reactions to stigmatized individuals, I focus on more like lab type of experiments. And if anyone's interested in any of the methods or any of the other topics, I'm happy to talk with them after the talk. Okay, so as I said, I will focus on that part. So if we go back to the objectives, stigma is a highly researched area. We actually know a lot about stigma. There is a plethora of research. And usually research focuses on causes of stigma, as well as its impacts on its targets. But there is not much research on effects of stigma research in the media. So what I mean by this is that there is a lot of research that focuses on bettering the lives of stigmatized individuals. And this research is very interesting. It gets picked up by the media very easily. But we don't know so much about the consequences of this media communication. So in today's talk, I will mostly focus on this. Particularly, I will focus on simple psychological interventions. I will get into what those are in a second, but for the time being, basically, these are psychological interventions are solutions to complex societal problems. So simple psychological interventions, as you can see, are very short, and they tend to focus on very complex problems through a very short manipulation. So if we think about a very simple fix to a complex problem, and when that gets picked up by the media and communicated to the media, my theory is that there can be unintended consequences of this communication. And I'll get to that in a second. So let's talk about psychological interventions a little bit, like more in general terms. If we talk about a more what I will call as complex intervention for today's talk, more traditional social psychological intervention, the goal is to focus on an issue from multiple points of view. So whatever tools we have, let's use all of them, let's attack this issue with like different hammers, and let's do all we can. That was the more like a traditional way to do an intervention. So a more traditional, more complex intervention in social psychology targets different aspects of an issue, as I said. So for example, it can target information, attitudes, or motivation. So for example, if we are talking about an intervention that's focused on healthy behaviors, such as safe sex behaviors, what would happen is that participants would receive information about safe sex behaviors, and then the goal would be also to change their attitudes towards safe sex behaviors. And then the researchers would also try to motivate participants to be more motivated to pursue such behaviors. So as you can see, that is a lot, right? So this kind of an intervention is usually expensive. It takes time. And obviously, anything that's expensive and takes time requires more resources. So for example, in an education type of setting, this would be something like changes in the curriculum, tutors in the school, and help with students who are having issues. So again, targeting an issue from multiple perspectives, using a lot of resources and time. And these interventions traditionally have been used in education and health domains. And if anyone here is from education areas, you know how hard it is to implement anything in schools, especially if it's taking a lot of time and money, right? So when we come to a more recent type of social psychological intervention, I will call them simple interventions for today's talk, but these include subtle manipulations, so very short, very subtle manipulations. And because of that, they're usually cheap, they're fast, and obviously everyone likes that, that's awesome, and because they use less resources. So these have been called new science or wise psychological interventions mostly by Stanford researchers who use this type of interventions. So if you see these in the literature, the simple and wise kind of can be used interchangeably. I will refer to them as simple for today's talk, but I just wanted to point that out. So let's look at what a simple intervention could look like. I don't know who likes to listen to NPR or look at Psychology Today or Stanford News or Wisconsin news. It's very interesting, right? Whenever we get like science news in the media, you don't have to be a communication expert. I know there are a couple of us, a couple of you in here who are, but even if you're just anyone interested in this kind of news, this will attract your attention. This is just so interesting. So this is an actual press release from Stanford News about a simple social psychological intervention. So it says, got an R, boost your grades. That sounds great. Like, I want to do that. That sounds awesome. Stanford psychologists designed a 60-minute exercise that raises GPAs of minority students. Okay, so we are looking at the racial achievement gap, minority students' GPAs, and it only takes 60 minutes to raise their GPAs. That sounds fabulous. I want to know more about this. This is so interesting. And actually, when I ask my participants, they say this is more interesting. This has better journalistic quality, indeed. So, but what I'm wondering is what happens when someone reads this? What's the impact? So in this study, what Stanford psychologists did was an affirmation exercise, which is a very common, simple psychological intervention. So this exercise involves getting students in the first class of the semester and giving them very simple intervention, giving them a piece of paper, asking them to talk about their values. So this could be any value that matter to them. For example, you can talk about family, sense of humor, being good at music, whatever it is that really speaks to you, and whatever it is that once you want to talk about, whatever value you have, you will just write about it for the rest of the class. And this exercise has been shown to boost students' grades in the next 3 years, as it says here, somewhere here, in the next 3 years. That sounds great too. And also, it has been also tested to promote belongingness and all these like other good outcomes you want in the classroom. So as you can see, this is something very simple, very cheap, and then it leads to all these positive outcomes. And what I was questioning was not the effectiveness of these interventions. That's not what I'm focusing on here. What I was questioning is that what happens when a white person reads this? So in study 2, my theory was that simple claims attract media attention because they're just so interesting, right? Yet they can lead to unintended influences. Particularly, I was focused on this. Attributions of responsibility and blame can be mentally undone, as shown by prior research. So what this means is that, so for example, we see someone in a negative situation. What we do is we look at them and then we tend to mentally backtrack their actions, and we tend to reach to this conclusion, well, they must have done this particular thing wrong, or they must have done this particular thing wrong. And then we have this kind of tendency to backtrack things. Because of this tendency we have, what could happen is that reading about simple interventions could lead to, for example, attributing responsibility when people fail. So my hypothesis specifically was that exposure to a simple psychological intervention will lead to underestimating the societal problem. So this is what the design looked like in the first study. What I've done is I had participants in two experimental conditions. Those in the complex condition, again, my participants did not receive the intervention. No one received an intervention in the study. They just read about the intervention. They read an actual press release covering the intervention. So in the simple condition, they just read an actual press release that we took from Stanford News, and they learned about this intervention that increases minority students' grades over 3 years, very subtle manipulation, all that good stuff. And in the complex intervention, they read the same language, but just the type of intervention was different. And then they reported their attributions of responsibility, as I'll talk about in a second. So let's start with the simple condition, actually. I'll move this side. So if you just look at this side, so this is actually from Stanford report, and it says a simple intervention bridges the achievement gap between African American and white students, Stanford researcher finds. A study shows how the academic achievement gap can be overcome by a simple assignment, so on and so forth. So very interesting study, right? So participants in the simple condition learned about this intervention. Again, all my participants were white, and so they were not getting the intervention, they were just learning about it. So they learned about this intervention, and participants in the complex condition learned about what we call the multifaceted intervention. So for this, I took an actual intervention that was done, and that had like a similar level of effectiveness, but it was, again, this very long intervention I talked about in the beginning that included changes in the school curriculum, professional tutors, and helping students who were having difficulties and so on. Again, very long, complex intervention. But in terms of the outcomes of the intervention, we kept the results the same, so we didn't change that part. So people reading it, basically the methods was different, but the outcome was the same. Students' grades were improved over the next 3 years. The only change we made was the original press release included instead of African American, Latino students. So I changed that to African American because we know from prior work that individuals might have a tendency to blame African Americans for their historic disadvantages. So we thought it would be a good way to dig into that tendency. Okay, so again, this is what the design looked like. The complex condition was titled multifaceted. It involved changes in the curriculum, professional tutors, program facilitators to assist teachers, regular assessment, and again, increase in grades. So you can see, very long, very no one wants to implement this kind of stuff. Like if you're trying to implement this, good luck, because, I don't know, school principals won't probably like you. So in the simple condition, it was titled simple. Again, we did not come up with the title or anything. It was taken from an actual press release. It included the values affirmation exercise I talked about before, and the same increase in grades over the next 3 years. So when participants learned about this, we wanted to ask them how they would rate ease of overcoming misfortune. So this included items such as, I think that minorities can overcome prejudice and discrimination if they apply themselves. In general, if minorities in America simply tried harder, they would be just as well off as whites. Sorry, that was a tongue twister. Okay, and this is what the results look like. So the y-axis is the ease of overcoming misfortune, and we had more items. I just want to bring a couple of them. As you can see, participants who learned about the simple intervention, which is the pink bar here, they attributed higher ease of overcoming misfortune than those who learned about the complex intervention. And this difference was significant. So does anyone have any clarification type of questions? Yes.
Yeah, so Alex, so I was wondering, in the complex situation, basically give them more messages. So how do you check that the participants really read each of the message in the complex situation versus the simple situation, because it's just the message amount?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually had manipulation checks, and a lot of the participants did not read it, so we did not focus on their data. We focused on only the ones who actually fit the suspicion and manipulation checks. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so Kaiping was asking about how do you make sure in the multifaceted condition participants learns about way more, many more messages, because it's just the intervention itself is just longer and more detailed. So she was asking whether how we checked for the fact that they actually learned about it. But we had manipulation checks at the end, so we asked participants if they remember details from each article, and they actually did, and the ones that didn't, we didn't use their data. Okay. So if there are any clarification questions at any point, please stop me, and then I would like to keep the big Q&A at the end. Okay, so in study 2, I was wondering whether targets of the interventions can impact the outcome. Because in the first study, all of the targets were African American students, right? So, but if the targets were white individuals, would we still get the same type of effect? So my hypothesis was that exposure to simple psychological intervention will lead to undermining the societal problem and also blaming the victim, only if the targets of the interventions are minorities. So this is what it looked like. Again, no one's receiving an intervention, everyone's learning about the intervention, right? So if you ignore this part, and if you just focus on this part first, if people learned about intervention targeting African Americans, half of our participants learned about intervention targeting African Americans, and half of that learned complex intervention, and half of them learned a simple intervention. So very similar to study 1, right? And then we also had these 2 experimental conditions where participants learned about intervention, this time targeting whites, and half of them learned about a complex intervention, and half of them learned about a simple intervention. So the goal here is that maybe just learning about a simple solution to a complex problem changes the way we think. So it's not about racial minorities, it's just about just learning about simple solution changes how we attribute things. But we'll see. Okay, so this time I want to focus on seemingly more controllable behavior, because we know that more behaviors or outcomes that seem more controllable tend to be stigmatized more. So we thought that could be a good way to test this, because it would have this tendency to be stigmatized even further. So in these 2 conditions, the simple intervention conditions, participants read this type of an article. So it was simple strategy to promote condom use, preaching what you know you should practice. So this was, again, a very short, simple manipulation to increase safe-sex behaviors. And half of the participants reading this read that it was targeting African Americans, and half of the participants reading this read that it was targeting white individuals. And then in the complex, we changed the intervention so that it included those like information, motivation, attitudes, people learning about safe-sex behaviors through a really long workshop. So this time for the dependent variables, the first dependent variable is the same as study 1, ease of avoiding misfortune. So the items were adapted so that they reflect the current content at hand. So individuals should not find it too hard to practice safer sex 100% of the time. It should be easy to overcome any temptation, and so on. And then this time we added what I believe is a more important dependent variable, which was blame, because if people are attributing that it's easier to avoid misfortune, then are they going to be blaming minorities different than majority? So this time we asked individuals who experience unwanted effects of risky sex, such as unplanned pregnancy, contracting HIV, or contracting other STDs, deserve no sympathy, are deserving of criticism, and items such as this one. Again, there were more items. I just want to bring out a few of them. So this is what the results look like for our first dependent variables. So it looks very similar to study 1, right? So if individuals learned about, so there was no interaction or anything, any main effects of intervention targets race. So this was more like if people learned about a simple intervention, they attributed higher ease of avoiding misfortune than they did if they learned about a complex intervention. So very similar. But when we come to our second dependent variable, which was blaming the victim, it looks a little bit different. So let's first focus on this part of the situation. So if the targets of the intervention were right, then what happens is that there is no difference if participants read about a complex or simple intervention. So let me backtrack. So if individuals learn about an intervention that is complex versus simple, and if the interventions are targeting white individuals, there is no difference. This difference is not significant. But if the interventions are targeting African Americans, then the picture looks a little bit different. Here you can see that if individuals learn about a simple intervention that targets African Americans, they attribute higher blame than to if they were to learn a complex intervention. So this was kind of sad finding, but it was kind of interesting. So it shows that basically these tendencies are further it's not only about learning about a simple solution. It really matters who we are talking about. If we are talking about African Americans, people react differently than not because they're reading the same exact intervention in these conditions. So that's not the point. So in study 3, now that we've established these effects, I was wondering what happens when different types of people read the same news? Because what happens is that when a politically conservative individual reads, again, something on NPR or Fox News or CNN, they react differently than a more politically liberal person reads that, right? So their reactions would be very different. So I was wondering what would be the impact of political ideology in this picture. Also, I was also wondering, can we frame the effect better? Because what happens is that whenever we hear about any science news, really, this is not even only psychology, we like simple fixes, right? We like magic bullets. We like these little sound bites of very interesting findings. Like I just saw something on social media on my way here. It was something like onions and olive oil decreases rates of cancer. And I was like, that sounds great because it fits my Mediterranean diet. That's awesome. So we like this kind of simple fixes to very big situations, problems in the society. But the thing is, the media also tends to frame these as these magic bullets that solve everything. It's this huge new thing. Okay, now garlic is going to fix your tendency to have cancer. So it likes this kind of simple findings. But if we can change how we frame these things, right? So what I was wondering was that, okay, let's not look at simple versus complex anymore because we know that there's a difference there. We've kind of established that across the two studies. But what I want to look at was, let's have the simple intervention in one condition. In the next condition, let's give people the same exact intervention, let them learn about the same exact thing, but this time frame it a little bit differently. Instead of saying this is the magic finding, let's say this is a big problem, and this is a tool in our toolbox. And let's see how people react to that. Again, there could be many different ways we could frame things, and that's exactly what I want to talk about at the end. This is just my preliminary attempt at doing that. And in the control condition, I gave people a simple fix to something completely relevant that I'll talk about. So, okay, let's just focus on the left part first. The first experimental condition read about a simple intervention targeting African Americans. And then the second experimental condition read about the same intervention, just presented differently. So this time the intervention was presented as more tool in our toolbox, this complex problem. And I'll show the details of that in a second. And then in the third experimental condition, participants learned about an intervention targeting environmental conservation. Because what I wanted to see was, if there's a difference between the two, which one is driving the effects? Is it the simple or is it the cautious? Which one is leading to this effect? And I wanted to prime this idea of there could be simple fixes to social problems without focusing on specific targets. So this one is, again, a very subtle manipulation, just trying to increase environmental conservatism. Okay, so this is what the design looked like. In the first condition, participants read this. Psychologists designed 60-minute exercise that raises GPAs of minority students, which you saw earlier. So the affirmation exercise that raises GPA. How are we doing with time? Okay. Okay. So they learned about this intervention in the first condition, which was the simple condition, right? In the second one, they learned about the same exact intervention. It just looked a little bit different. So it looked like psychologists test benefits of a new technique to raise GPAs. But the intervention, again, is the same exact intervention. So, for example, in the first condition, it says, the answer Stanford psychologists suggest involves blah, 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 which sounds awesome. Like, if that's the answer, that's perfect. But that's usually how things get reported. It's not even only psychology, right? And in the cautious condition, I framed it as a new weapon Stanford psychologists suggest, and tried to see if that helps. And spoiler alert, kind of, not really. It's kind of anticlimactic. Okay, in the third condition, they got a completely different intervention. It was changing minds and changing towels. So how you would go about using a simple fix to persuade individuals to use less towels in hotels and promote environmental conservation. So the goal here was to, again, not to focus on specific target characteristics, but to focus on more there can be a simple fix to a complex solution, and just to make that idea more salient in people's minds. Okay, the dependent variables were the same as study 2. The first one is ease of avoiding misfortune. This time, we focus on adjusting to college because the intervention focused on that. In general, I think if black college students in America simply tried harder, they should do just as well in school as whites, and items similar to that. So general items, but mostly focusing on college adjustment. And the second dependent variable was, again, blaming the victim. So I think if black college students deserve little to no sympathy if they choose to drop out of college, and items such as that one. Okay, so let's look at what happens. Let's first look at the general picture. Okay, so the y-axis is ease of adjusting to college. The x-axis is political ideology. If we go back and just look at the overall broad picture of what happens, it's not exactly surprising. If you go from extremely liberal to extremely conservative, as you can see, they all increase. All of these slopes are significant. So the more conservative individuals get, the more they attribute ease of adjusting to college. Not exactly that's surprising, right? Because it fits into conservative ideology that you should pull yourself from your bootstraps and so on. But let's focus on the right side of the graph. So if we focus here, what we see is that, okay, so the gray line is the simple condition. The red line is the cautious condition, so the same intervention framed in a more cautious way. And then the blue line is the control condition, the one about towels. So as you can see, the difference between the cautious and the simple for extremely conservative, there's no difference. Those are the same. So even if we frame things in a more cautious way, actually it does not change ease of adjusting to college, how the ratings of ease of adjusting to college, because it's still significantly higher blame put in comparison to the control condition. So that's kind of sad, right? Because I did all the framing, it didn't really work, but again, there could be many different ways this could be framed more effectively. But when we come to our second dependent variable, the picture is a little bit different. We still have the same impact of political ideology and blaming African Americans for not adjusting to college. Again, not so surprising. If you're not adjusting to college, it's your own blame. You should have pulled yourself from your bootstraps. Makes sense. But if we go to the right side of the graph again, this time the finding is a little bit different. Here you can see that the cautious, so the red line is the cautious one, and the blue line is the control one. So the cautious and control has no significant difference for the extremely conservative. So when things are framed differently, but in the simple condition, which is the gray line, there is higher blame for adjusting to college attributed compared to the other two conditions. So this shows that in terms of blame, which I believe is the more important thing to focus on, what happens is actually framing things in a more cautious way somewhat works. it helps a little bit. So I think that this is why I think it's important to talk about how we can frame things better, especially because I know this group will have a lot of really good ideas about how we can better that. Okay, so what we learned from these set of studies is that exposure to simple psychological interventions lead to blaming of the individuals the interventions were actually designed to assist. And this effect is particularly pronounced in conservative perceivers because it fits into the ideology, and because of that, it is even enhanced for if the perceivers are conservative. So let's step back and talk about implications of this, especially for science communication, and also for the field of psychology as well. So I'll start more narrow and I'll try to broaden this a little bit. So if we look at it for the field of psychology, I think we need more science communication. And in general, we need more science communication that does not undermine societal problems. And I don't know how we can do that, but I would like to open it for discussion in a second to get your ideas about how we can do that, because I definitely think we need more on that. And another research direction I want to take in the future is that how do stigmatized individuals perceive this communication? Because all of my participants were, as you saw, white. So it would be different if, let's say, an intervention is targeting African Americans and a perceiver is reading about a press release about this intervention, and he or she is also African American. So that could be a different condition, because if I am someone who is struggling with adjusting to college because of stigma and discrimination and all of that, and I am reading about this simple fix that should have worked, then maybe I will get angry, maybe I will get hopeful. I don't know what the reaction would be. So I think that's also another way to look at it. How would actually targets of these interventions, how do they react to reading about these? And if you look at it a little bit more broadly, we can see that I think as researchers, we generally have some kind of a pressure to publish and also streamline our findings for dissemination, right? Because part of our job is actually disseminating our findings. And we do this because it leads to maybe easier communication on social media, easier communication with journalists. It might be liked more. So I'm not sure, but we might have this pressure to streamline our findings. And this pressure might lead us to focus on simple and more provocative research questions, right? So that could be a case. I'm just trying to check the time. But the thing is, what could be other unintended consequences that we can focus on? What are other unintended consequences we need to be more aware of? Especially in terms of more generally, like let's say if we are talking about health. Let's say if there is any research that shows that obesity rates can be decreased by a simple fix, and this is the new diet, this is the new thing that people should be following. I don't know anything about obesity research, don't quote me on this. But if there is a new finding on that, then will people reading it perceive it differently based on if they are talking about a racial minority or not? Will that lead to further victim blaming? Can this apply to other fields in that regard, especially regarding to health and education? These are all, I think, things that we can ponder upon and try to find answers to. And in some of my current research, I am actually doing an intervention, so I thought it could be interesting to talk about. So this project is funded by NSF, and it's focused on discrepancies in STEM fields. So as I said, my work is really influenced by culture and context. And in the culture and context of STEM, women tend to be stigmatized a lot. And what is really interesting is that if you look at PhD graduates of STEM fields, there is a gender gap, but it's not that big. But the more you go higher up, as you go higher up in the academic ladder, it increases and increases. But what seems to be happening is that during the postdoc, for some reason, we are losing a lot of women. I don't know why, but that seems to be the gateway stage for when the gender gap really goes drastic. So after the postdoc, it is really high. So it seems like we are losing a lot of women in postdoc. So in this study, what I am focusing on is women's underrepresentation in STEM fields, especially in advanced careers. And because postdoc stage seems to be the gateway for that, in diversifying STEM, what kind of interventions can we do? So this study, which I won't get into today because I'm still analyzing the results, but I can talk about it next year. But in this study, what I've done is a mentoring intervention and to see if learning about different mentoring tips will help women stay in these STEM fields in the long run. But this also leaves me in a weird existential crisis too, because what if once this study is completed and hopefully I'll get interesting good results out of it, hopefully my intervention works, then what if this is picked up by the media, and then what's going to happen then? So is this going to lead to further victim blaming? Is this going to be if women are failing in STEM fields, it's because they should have worked harder and they should have focused on their careers instead of their families? I don't know, whatever gender stigmatizing ideologies it will tap into. And in general, how do we communicate this type of research? It's not only my research. There's a lot of intervention research, and there's a lot of findings in general that aim to better society. So how do we go about this? So that's all I have. So sorry to end on such an anticlimactic note, but I would like to open it for discussion and get all of your ideas. And before I end, I would like to thank all of my collaborators and mentors and NSF for funding the project, and thank you, Dominique, for inviting me here today. And thank you all of you for being here.